All right, so before we get talking about the most important overarching topic of this lesson, which is the Articles of Confederation, the minor strengths and the major weaknesses of the document, the first thing that we need to do is talk about state governments. So state governments were actually our country's first government before we established a federal government. We still had states that were kind of managing each other and making sure that their citizens knew what was expected of them and things of that nature. So New Hampshire is actually the first colony to organize as a state, and this happened in January of 1776. Just like any good state or any good government, the first order of business was to draft a constitution. Now, what a constitution is a detailed written plan for government, all right? So one of the first things that you need to do if you are establishing a new government is write out a plan for it. It's kind of hard to successfully govern your own population if you don't have rules and procedures set forth that the citizenry can kind of understand and use as a reference point in terms of their relationships with their government. So within a few years, all of the former 13 colonies followed New Hampshire's example and set up their own state constitutions. And I want to ask you all a very important question. Why are constitutions important? So take a couple of minutes and think about why constitutions are so important, whether it be a federal constitution or a state constitution. Now, obviously, constitutions are going to be very important because the citizens of a state or of a country need to know what's expected of them. They need to know what the procedures are, how to interact with their government, what roles the government plays in their daily lives, what roles the government plays in terms of their protections, and things of that nature. So constitutions are very, very important because it sets a rule book for how citizens interact with their government. Each state, just like the federal government, has a legislature, and the main goal of every legislature is to make laws. The majority of the legislatures were bicameral. So we're going to get into a bicameral legislature in a little bit more detail further on in the video. It's a very, very important concept, but you need to know the vocabulary word bicameral. Bicameral means two houses, right? The prefix bi means two. A bicycle has two wheels. So a bicameral legislature is a legislature made up of two houses, all right? And in this example, it's the House of Representatives and the Senate, all right? So understand that key vocab word, bicameral. On the executive side, each state also had a governor. So if you think of the executive or the chief executive of the United States as the president, the chief executive of the state is the governor. Governors were elected by the legislature or the citizens, depending on the state in which we're talking, and the main duty of any executive is to carry out the laws. Now, we talked about the legislative. Their main goal is to make laws, right? The main goal of the executive, in this case the governor, is to carry out the laws. Each state also had courts. Judges in the courts interpreted the law, and that is the key of any judiciary, right? They want to make sure that they are applying the laws fairly, interpreting the laws, and making sure that the executive is carrying them out properly. All right, so inside of the state governments, you had this idea of a three-branch system where you had the legislature, which made the laws, you had the governor who was enforcing the laws, and the judicial or the judiciary who were interpreting the laws. Many new governments in terms of the state also had a Bill of Rights. Included were individuals' rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is one of the Enlightenment ideas that John Locke focuses on. Most state constitutions obviously contain a Bill of Rights, and the purpose of any Bill of Rights, or in Florida's case, we have a Declaration of Rights, is just to guarantee basic freedoms and protections for that state's citizenry. All right? So just to make sure that those citizens have their basic rights protected. An example of this could be a trial by jury and protection of personal property, so nobody can go around and start stealing your personal property. But basically every constitution that you see, whether it's a state level or the U.S. federal government, will have some sort of Bill of Rights just outlining what rights are protected by the government. Now, our first attempt as a nation at a federal constitution is what we call the Articles of Confederation. So each state was ready to govern itself when independence was declared. Some states proved too big for the state, or some tasks and issues were way too big for the states to handle alone. Example, a lot of the states couldn't raise and support a large army. American leaders knew that 13 separate colonies would not be able to fight off the British one by one. So for example, if Britain invaded Virginia, right, New York under the Articles of Confederation really didn't have the responsibility to go help out Virginia. So that puts a lot of pressure on the states to be able to defend themselves. So we knew as a country, right, the framers of the Constitution understood that we needed to form a single government, a strong government with central control. Now, coming off of the Revolutionary War, this idea probably rubbed a lot of the new Americans the wrong way, because we just kind of fought a war to separate ourselves from a strong totalitarian central government, right? So the idea that we needed a stronger central government is something that the new Americans at this time are going to be a little bit weary about. So at the Second Continental Congress, the framers of the Constitution, or in this case the Articles, planned for a confederation of states. Now, the vocabulary word confederation is just a group of individual states that unite for a common purpose. So like I said with the example before with Virginia and New York, Virginia kind of cared about Virginia. They didn't necessarily care about New Jersey or New York or Delaware, right? They were kind of self-interested. Yes, they were under the umbrella of America, but they were more interested about their own state than the country as a whole. Now, that's not really a good way of creating a strong country when you have states that are kind of interested in themselves instead of the greater good. In 1777, the Congress decided to write out these plans, and this is what we call the Articles, and the Articles are going to be the first constitution in the United States. Now, what I like to tell my students is it was more like the divided states of America under the Articles of Confederation than it was the United States of America under the Articles. Okay, you had states that were more self-interested in protecting themselves, didn't really see the necessity to go help out other states when they were in need. So what the Articles did was set up a league of friendship among independent states. By 1781, all 13 states had ratified the Articles of Confederation. Vocabulary word that you guys need to know is ratify, okay? To ratify is to approve or pass. The Articles created a one-house legislature known as the Confederation Congress, right? So we talked about bicameral being a two-house legislature. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had a one-house legislature known as the Confederation Congress. And what they did was they controlled the army that had the power to deal with foreign countries on behalf of the U.S. So here is one of the successes of the Articles of Confederation. So Congress passed two ordinances. Okay, another word for ordinance is a law, and these affected the young United States. Okay, both had to do with the old Northwest. We're talking about Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc. So you have the Ordinance of 1785, and this set up plans for surveying Western lands. Basically, we had all this territory that was now ours, all right? And probably the best course of action when you just acquire a bunch of territory is to go out and see what it looks like, to go out and survey it, observe it, see what's going on, measure it, and all of that good stuff. So to survey in this context is to measure a piece of land. What the Northwest Ordinance did was actually divide the Western lands into townships, all right? So if you take a look at the map of the United States and take a look either the state shape or the shape of the towns, okay? The further west you go, let's say you start at the on the Atlantic Ocean, the further west you go, the more square everything looks, right? Now, that's for two reasons. One is geography. It's very hard to set up perfectly square towns or states when you have an ocean as a border, right? Because that's just inherently going to be uneven. But the other reason why is when the colonists settled in the Northeast, they weren't thinking about independence just yet, right? They weren't thinking that they would need to set up their own governments. They weren't thinking about a federal system where states and the federal government had power and local governments had power. So because of the geography of the East Coast and subsequently the West Coast, right? And because of just the historical context, everything towards the east looks a little bit jagged. Everything all the way out to the west looks a little bit jagged. But everything in the middle is pretty square. And that's because we had time to think about how we wanted to divide this up. So townships were split into 36 sections, and each section is 1 square mile. Okay? So the Northwest Ordinance, right, set up governments in the new surveyed Northwest Territory. So this is another success of the Articles of Confederation. Okay? So what the Northwest Ordinance did, after the Ordinance of 1785 went out and surveyed the land, the Northwest Ordinance actually set up a plan for basically setting up governments and then admitting new states into the Union. Both the Northwest Ordinance and the Ordinance of 1785 helped people settle in the West in an orderly fashion. Again, these being two of the major successes of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. Now let's get to the weaknesses. So obviously we do not follow the Articles of Confederation currently. We follow the U.S. Constitution, and there's a reason for that. All right? So Congress cannot pass laws unless 9 states voted for it. So that is a supermajority, because if you take half of 13, right, and then you take 9, 9 is way more than half of 13. Now, this is a major issue. I told you already that the states were kind of self-interested. So the interests of New York definitely didn't align with the interests of South Carolina, for example. So because of that, right, it was very, very hard for laws to be passed. Like if I surveyed you all in my classroom and I said, who wants ice cream and who wants cookies, okay? It'd be very hard to get 9 out of 13 of you to agree on one specific dessert. So think about issues that are way more complex and way more challenging. It's very hard to get 9 out of 13 to agree to pass laws. And even harder, all 13 states needed to agree on any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So 100% of the states needed to agree on any changes, any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. That's really hard, right? If I took 13 of you in the class and again tried to get all of you to decide what we were going to order for our class party this year in terms of food, it would be basically impossible to get all of you to agree on it. And because of this, you almost get a paralysis or the inability to do anything under the Articles of Confederation. You needed 9 states to vote in order to pass a law, just a law, okay? And all 13 to agree to any amendments. That's not an efficient way of doing government. Now, the purpose was noble, right? The reason why they made it difficult is so that larger states didn't have control over the smaller states, but we're going to get into how they kind of solved that problem a little bit later. All right, Congress also lacked power and money. So governments need one thing to function, and that one thing is money, okay? Every government needs it, just like every business needs it. So they couldn't collect taxes, right? Which means they had no money. They couldn't regulate trade. Okay, so in between states, they couldn't regulate trade. They also couldn't regulate trade with other countries. And they couldn't enforce its laws. So they couldn't even pass laws, basically. And then the laws that they did pass, they couldn't even enforce, right? So that's going to be an issue when you're trying to run a government. And all of this boils down to just a lack of central power. Now, we understand why, right, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was stripped of its power. Because the early Americans were fearful that if they gave the central government too much power, they'd wind up like England, okay? And they just fought a war to rid themselves of England. So it makes sense on paper as to why they stripped the federal government of a tremendous amount of power. Also, you had no single leader or group directed by government policy and no national court system. So no courts, no executive, basically. All the power was in the Confederation Congress, but the Confederation Congress was severely limited by how they pass laws and how they amend the articles. And also, they had no money. Okay, that's going to be a huge issue. If you don't have money, you can't do anything. All right? The rules were also too rigid. Okay, we kind of talked about this. Congress couldn't pass laws without the approval of 9 states, and the articles could not be changed without the approval of all 13. So, just to recap, okay? Major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Couldn't collect taxes, couldn't support an army, couldn't regulate trade, couldn't pass laws, couldn't amend the document, okay? These are all major downsides of the Articles of Confederation, okay? 2 successes, you have the Ordinance of 1785, which set up a plan for surveying the land in the Northwest area, okay? And then you have the Northwest Ordinance, which basically set up a plan for admitting these states into the Union. Let me slap myself over here. Okay, so we just wrapped up talking about the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation starts a chain reaction, right? And this kind of is the catalyst for the argument between state government power and federal power, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the chapter, all right? But just know, federal government, state government, where is the balance? This is what young America is trying to figure out. So Shays Rebellion highlights the flaws of the Articles of Confederation better than any event in American history, right? So we talked about some of the successes in the Northwest Ordinance and the Ordinance of 1785. Another success were the U.S. forcing British to accept their new independence. This is the Treaty of Paris in 1783. All right, and this formally ends the fighting between Britain and the new nation for the time being. So if you know your history, we do have a couple of skirmishes with England moving forward. So Shays Rebellion, okay? The U.S. was in debt due to Congress borrowing money to pay for the revolution, okay? Basically, everything in government and life boils down to money. So it's not cheap to fight a war, okay? The United States fought a revolution against the most powerful government in the world, in the British Empire. So obviously, by borrowing money, you need to pay that money back. State governments were also in debt, all right? So what does any good government do when they need more money? Yes, you're right. They raised taxes, okay? So state governments began to tax the citizens extremely heavily, all right? Now, if you know anything about economics, when you tax a business, that sucks the business dry of extra money that they could be used to kind of like grow their business, right? So if you're paying more of your income to taxes, you have less stuff to produce, you have less stuff to trade, you have less money to make because you have less stuff, all right? So it kind of starts a chain reaction here. So what happens is trade slows, and when trade slows, people can't afford to keep their employees, and people lost jobs. Farmers also couldn't sell their crops, and they went into debt, okay? So if you can't sell what you produce, you're losing money, all right? Less people on your farm means you're producing less, all right? So all of this boils down to is because of state taxes being so high, it forces all of the local people that are living in the state to go into debt too because they can't make money on their crops and things of that nature. States also began to tax imports from other states, right? So that's like if I was selling Florida oranges to New York, right? And New York was sending me back apples. But when I was taking in the apples from New York, I was taxing them, okay? Now, we don't do this under the Constitution. It doesn't make sense to tax other states because we are one country. But again, another set of taxes is going to decrease the amount of money that all of these business people are making and hurt trade, right? Because if you're getting taxed heavily on your goods, chances are you're not going to send as much or maybe you won't send anything because of the increase in the taxes. Obviously, merchants and business people are going to suffer, and the Confederation Congress, right, had no power to fix these problems. They had their own issues, right? They couldn't tax. They had no money. They had no power to regulate intrastate trade, okay, trade between states. So we were kind of in a pretty severe predicament on the state level and also on the federal level. So when this happens, a lot of Americans are going to have a negative outlook on the future. So a lot of Americans feared that the government couldn't protect them. Riots broke out in a lot of states. Okay? In Massachusetts, a farmer named Daniel Shays owed money due to state taxes. Okay? And then the courts threatened to take his farm away. Right? So because he was taxed so heavily, he couldn't produce as many goods. And because he couldn't produce as many goods, he couldn't pay the taxes. So it becomes this circular problem, right? State taxes Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays has to get rid of his employees and can't make as much money as he used to. Therefore, he can't pay back the state taxes. It creates this giant circle of issues for not only Daniel Shays, but a lot of people in his similar situation. And I know the image here is kind of cut off, but it says the courts threatened to take away his farm. So people, including Shays, thought the government should not punish its citizens for a problem that they created, right? It's not Shays' fault that the state governments and the federal governments were out of money, but unfortunately, they were the ones that were paying the price. So Shays led 1,200 protesters on an attack of the federal arsenal, and this becomes known as Shays Rebellion, and this is kind of the catalyst that the United States needed to kind of like encounter in order to understand that the Articles of Confederation is never going to work, okay? You can't force the citizenry to pay these tremendous taxes because of a problem that you created and expect everything to go well, right? That circular issue with Daniel Shays, owing state taxes, having less things to produce, therefore making less money, therefore not being able to pay the state taxes, is kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So after the rebellion, a lot of politicians, merchants, and writers began calling for a stronger central government. Remember, but we're still a little bit weary about a strong central government because we just fought a tyrannical, strong central government in England, and we're kind of reluctant to do the same thing in America. Delegates from 12 states attended a meeting in Philly. Their goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, and this was known as the Constitutional Convention. All right? So delegates are just representatives from 12 of the states. They met in Philly, and their goal was to take the Articles and rework it. Again, under the Articles, you had 13 kind of like loosely joined, kind of independent states that were self-interested about themselves and not necessarily about the country. And in order to create a stronger central government, they met in Philadelphia. Rhode Island didn't participate because they feared a strong central government. Now, Rhode Island is a fairly small state. It's the smallest state in the Union. So obviously, they're going to be scared of a strong central government that could potentially take advantage of them. And the Constitutional Convention took place in Independence Hall. So if you guys are ever in Philadelphia, definitely go check out Independence Hall. It's a really cool spot. So 55 well-educated men with political experience gathered in Philly, right? Lawyers, merchants, and college presidents, generals, governors, all very important people in the young American country at the time. 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence, 41 were members of the Continental Congress, and Ben Franklin was the oldest, actually at 81 years old here. So you got the heavy hitters in American history, right? All of these men meeting to solve probably one of the most critical problems in the history of the world, which is how do we allow this new country to survive, all right? We gave it our first shot under the Articles of Confederation, had some wins, had a lot of failures. Shays Rebellion kind of highlights that for us, knowing that this form of government cannot carry on just because of the way that it's structured. So you got all of the heavy hitters there, the all-star team in terms of your political class in the early America, all trying to solve the issue of how do we represent the people better, how do we create a stronger government that fills in the gaps that the Articles left, but also doesn't take away rights of our citizens. So these delegates would go on to be senators, serve in the House, and federal judges. Jefferson and Adams were absent. They were actually in the United States, or actually in Europe representing the United States. These men would go on to frame the Constitution. George Washington was elected to kind of guide the Constitutional Convention, and his insights were valued. Obviously, he's the general that led America to victory in the Revolution, and this team of all-stars thought that Washington was the best guy for the job. There's just no other way of putting it. Washington himself was pretty, I don't know if disinterested is a word, but he was a humble person, and he took upon this leadership and did the best that he could in the Constitutional Convention, and I'd say that it paid off. So you have a bunch of issues here, right, that needed to be solved. So each state would have one vote regardless of the amount of delegates representing that state. Okay, 7 votes, a simple majority would solve that issue. The delegates kept the meeting secret and basically to ensure that everybody could speak their mind. The windows were closed, the doors were guarded, even in the summer heat in Philly. The delegates' priority was to revise the Articles of Confederation, okay? But once the delegates realized the AOC was doomed, a new document was drafted, and this is the Constitution. So theoretically, these guys committed treason during the Constitutional Convention because they took the active government of the United States, crumpled it up, threw it out the window, and started fresh, all right? Now, it was going to take way too much work to actually revise the Articles. It's a lot easier just to start from scratch, and this is the birth of the Constitution. Now, 2 plans arise in the Constitutional Convention. Okay, the first is the Virginia Plan, and the next is the New Jersey Plan, and each have attributes that benefit a certain amount of states. So this featured a president, a court system, and a Congress with 2 houses. We know that is called a bicameral legislature. State population dictated the number of state representatives, right? So if you had a larger population, you got more representatives, all right? Now, this works really well for large states like Virginia because they have a lot of people, right? So obviously, large states are going to favor the Virginia Plan because they have a larger population, therefore they get more representation, okay? Delegates from states with a lot of people, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, really like this. Now, delegates from smaller states probably hated this idea because obviously if the larger states have more population, right, they have more representation, therefore their decisions weigh more, or their input weighs more than the smaller states, okay? So a genius thing happened, which we'll get to, all right? But first we need to go through the New Jersey Plan. So what the New Jersey Plan did was kept the Confederation Congress's one-house legislature, okay? Each state would get 1 vote, okay? So doesn't matter if you have a large population, doesn't matter if you have a small population, you all get the same amount of votes. Okay, Congress had the power to regulate trade and set taxes. That's very important. Instead of a president, a committee named by Congress would carry out the laws. Delegates from smaller states are obviously going to back this because that gives them equal power as the larger states. And the larger states opposed it because they thought the population should dictate constitutional or congressional power. So both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan have a point, right? It makes sense that if you have a larger population, you should get more representation. You have more people to worry about, therefore you need more people to govern them, right? It makes sense. But also, it makes sense under the New Jersey Plan to give everybody an equal vote, okay? So what we decided to do, right, is known as the Great Compromise, all right? And this is where we get America's bicameral legislature. What the Great Compromise does is it takes the Virginia Plan that benefits larger states. It takes the New Jersey Plan, right, that benefits smaller states, and it puts it together in a 2-house bicameral legislature. So Congress would have two houses. The Senate gets 2 votes per state, okay? So it's even. Regardless of population, every single state gets 2 votes. In the House of Representatives, this would be based on population, okay? So the smaller states love the Senate because everything's equal. The larger states like the House of Representatives because they get more representation due to their larger populations. Now, neither side was fully pleased, but they agreed on it, okay? You never get everything that you want in a compromise, but what's good about the compromise is you get the majority of what you want. So the Senate and the House come together. You have the Virginia plan, which is representation based on population. That goes into the House of Representatives. You have the New Jersey plan, which is equal representation regardless of population. You put that together, you get our bicameral legislature. Some less glamorous compromises were made as well. So the 3/5 compromise dealt with the issue of slavery and representation in Congress. So about 550,000 African Americans were enslaved at this time, and based on population, the southern states would have more votes in the House of Representatives. All right. So the southern states up until this point treated slaves as property, right? They said, you are not human, you are our property, and it's horrible and it's messed up, but that's the way that they thought about it. Now that the issue of population equal representation was on the table, the southern states kind of changed their tune a little bit. They said, whoa, wait a minute. These African Americans in our states count as our population. So they're playing a little bit of both sides of the fence here. They're saying, hey, yeah, I know that we called them property previously, but they're actually not property. They're part of our population. Therefore, they should count to our total in the House of Representatives. So the northern states are obviously going to argue against this and say that slaves technically were property, like the southern states argued 10 minutes ago, and they shouldn't count as the vote. So what happened here is known as the 3/5 compromise. So for every 5 slaves, 3 would count as free men in terms of representation, okay? So if you had 10 slaves, 6 would count as free men, right? This ruling was for population and used for taxes as well, all right? So even within the delegation of the Constitutional Convention, you still had arguments between the southern delegates and the northern delegates on that issue of slavery and what does it mean in terms of representation. Okay, you have some other compromises as well. So northern states felt Congress should be able to regulate trade. Southern states feared that Congress would tax exports, which would hurt the southern economy. The South worried that Congress might try to stop the import of slaves as well. So the North agreed to allow Congress, or to not allow Congress to end the slave trade for 20 years, and the South agreed to allow Congress to regulate trade. So the South says, cool, we'll allow you to regulate trade, but you can't stop the import of slavery, and you can't tax exports, all right? So the North and South come to another agreement here as well. Now the last agreement is the Electoral College. So this was the agreement on how the president should be elected. Some delegates thought Congress should elect the president, others thought the people should. So what they came up with is kind of like a combination. So the compromise is known as the Electoral College. The Electoral College is made up of electors, delegates named by each state legislature, and these electors pick the president and the vice president based on the state's popular vote, all right? So yes, the people do vote for the president. Based on that vote, the delegates or the electors will actually go ahead and put that vote in their state legislature. We're going to get into the Electoral College in a little bit more detail a little bit later on, but just know right now that this is part of one of those compromises that occurred during the Constitutional Convention. All right, so the last thing that I want to cover in this video is the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. All right, so we talked about a bunch of compromising, right? We talked about the Electoral College. We talked about the 3/5 compromise. We talked about the Great Compromise, creating a bicameral legislature, right? So there's a lot of competing and conflicting ideas going on during the Constitutional Convention, one of those being the battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. When we're talking about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, we need to understand the word federal, okay? The federal government is the national government. So if you are a Federalist, okay, you are in favor of a strong national government, all right? We know under the Articles of Confederation, strong state governments, not a good idea, right? Too much power was in the states. The federal government didn't have enough power. Obviously, through things like Shays Rebellion, we knew that that system wouldn't work. But we're also scared of giving too much power to the federal government, right? Because we saw what happened if the federal government has as much power as England had, right? It becomes oppressive, it becomes totalitarian, and the citizens suffer. So America is really grappling with this idea of how do we balance power between a federal government and a state government to ensure that each takes responsibility for what logically they should and the citizens don't get abused by it. So those who supported the Constitution were known as Federalists. They believed a strong central government should be supreme over state laws, and their biggest talking point was reminding everybody about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Strong national government was needed to protect rights. If you didn't have a strong national government, your rights could not be protected. Leaders such as Hamilton, James Madison argued the Constitution could solve the nation's problems, all right? And also kind of like defend America abroad. Now, we talked about the deficiencies in the Articles where they couldn't raise a strong enough army. If you can't have an army, you can't protect yourself, all right? So that's another talking point that the Federalists used to kind of hammer home the point that, hey, the Articles showed us that we swung the pendulum too far, right? On this side, you have England, totalitarian and evil and oppressive. On this side, you had the Articles of Confederation, way too much state power, not enough power to the federal government. And what they decided was the answer is somewhere in the middle, okay? You have federal government here, you have state governments here. You figure out how to balance that power, and that is the Constitution. So you had your Federalists, but you also have your Anti-Federalists. And these people believe that the Constitution isn't the way to go. They believe that the Constitution would destroy freedoms, believe that the newly created government would ignore the rights of the people, and they saw a key weakness in the Constitution, which is it had no Bill of Rights, all right? It didn't state exactly what the government's purpose and protections were for the citizens. So several states agreed to ratify the Constitution. Ratify means to agree. If it guaranteed that rights would be protected, okay? And then once 9 ratified the Constitution, so 9 out of 13, the United States of America was born. So this compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists really hung in the balance in terms of the Bill of Rights. So the Federalists said, hey, we don't like the Constitution, it gives way too much power to the federal government. But if you add a Bill of Rights, if you specifically list what you're protecting, we will ratify, we will approve the Constitution, right? So the Federalists got what they want by creating a stronger central government that could meet the needs of the people better. And the Anti-Federalists got what they want in a list, known as the Bill of Rights, of specific protections that the government was going to provide the people.